This screencast accompanies this PowerPoint presentation detailing the observations made by Galileo Galilei in the early 17th century. Here's a nice painting of Galileo when he was an old man. He was tried and convicted by the Catholic Church for his support of the Copernican system. I'll describe that in greater detail a little bit later on in the semester. As I describe in a lecture, his telescopic observations are the first direct observations that were made that do in fact support the Copernican solar system. Before I get to Galileo's observations in detail, I also want to briefly mention this man, Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno was a Catholic monk who lived around the same time as Galileo, but unlike Galileo, who was politically well connected, Bruno was not. Bruno was burnt at the stake by a mob in Rome in 1600 for, among his other beliefs, his support of the Copernican system. Bruno is also remembered today as being one of the first people to hypothesize that the stars are objects that are just like the sun, and if the sun has a family of planets in orbit around it, then perhaps other stars also have planets in orbit around them. So he was one of the first people to hypothesize the existence of planets orbiting other stars. Okay, a statue was erected in Rome in 1889 at the site of his execution. Okay, now getting to Galileo's telescopes. Okay, contrary to common belief, Galileo actually did not invent the telescope, but he was the first person to use it for important purposes, looking at celestial objects, and he popularized the instrument. In part, he was able to build his fortune through the use of the telescope. His most famous telescopic observations occurred in 1609. Okay, this particular instrument here, his telescopes do survive to this day, by the way. This particular instrument here was very primitive. It only had a magnification of about 9 times. A little bit later on, Galileo built some more powerful telescopes. The best that he was able to build had a magnification of about 30 times. His telescopes do survive to this day. Currently, they are housed at the Museum of the History of Science in Florence, Italy. Galileo popularized his observations in a book. His book was then published, and it basically made him famous throughout Europe. Galileo basically sketched out what he saw through his telescope, and he wasn't the world's greatest artist, but he did get his ideas across. So first of all, we have these important observations of the moon. This is what the moon looks like. This is one of his sketches at relatively low magnification. And then when you do look at the moon through a simple telescope such as Galileo, you begin to recognize what cannot be anything else other than geographical features: mountains, valleys, craters, and so on. So for the first time in history, the moon now starts to be thought of as a place. Okay, here is some higher magnification sketches of what Galileo saw when he looked at the moon. We have a depiction here of a valley. Here's a nice mountain range. Here's a crater, and so on and so forth. Okay, then we get to these important observations with respect to the 4 major moons of Jupiter, now referred to today as the Galilean satellites. If you watch the positioning of the moon over successive nights, as is being depicted here in these simple diagrams, you see the relative positions of the moons change with respect to the planet. Galileo realizes that he's looking at orbital motion, the orbits of these moons, for example, as they circle the planet Jupiter. The reason why this observation is so important is because it's the first direct observational evidence of motion in the sky that is definitely not centered on the Earth. These moons, by the way, are referred to as the Galilean satellites or the Galilean moons. They are named Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. They are fascinating places in their own right. Then we have the planet Saturn. The planet Saturn is pretty far out in the solar system, and Galileo's telescopes not only were not very powerful, but the optical quality of his telescopes were not very good either. So when he saw the rings of Saturn, he didn't realize exactly what it was that he was seeing. His observations were not good enough to discern the true nature of the rings. That came a little bit later on, further in the 17th century. Galileo referred to the rings as ears. He also made some sketches of sunspots. We have some nice large sunspot groupings here in this particular diagram that he drew. But then lastly, we get to these all-important observations with respect to the planet Venus. If you watch the planet Venus over time, it changes its apparent size in your telescope, and it also goes through a series of phases. It starts off, for example, looking quite small through the telescope, and it shows up basically as a gibbous. Then it gets larger as a quarter, gets larger still as a crescent. Galileo realized that the only way to explain these observational facts is that the planet Venus is orbiting the sun closer than the Earth is. Now, this is a very primitive sketch here, so let me show you next a much more modern depiction of this sketch. That's this series of photographs here. This series of photographs here would be taken in the early morning hours. You would start off, for example, with the planet being large in your telescope, and it would show up as a crescent. But then as time goes on, it gets smaller in your telescope, and it also begins to show up as a quarter, begins to show up as a gibbous, and so on. Obviously, this string of photographs has been put together here to give you an idea of the motion. Basically, what we're looking at here is the planet Venus moving faster in its orbit than we are because it's closer to the sun, and then therefore we see it receding from us as it is past the Earth in its orbit. Okay, here's a nice depiction of the situation. This then allows us to fully understand why this observation definitively proves that the planets orbit the sun. So we have here the Earth in the foreground, and then we're looking at the motion of the planet Venus with respect to the Earth's reference frame, not with respect to the sun. So you would begin, for example, by observing the planet Venus in sunset. At sunset, you would begin by seeing it small in your telescope as a gibbous. And then over weeks and into months, you would see it get larger in the telescope, show up as a quarter, larger still, show up as a crescent. Basically, Venus is catching up to the Earth in its orbit. Then there's a period of a couple of weeks where basically Venus is in between the Earth and the sun, where the planet is not visible at all. And then a little bit after that, then you'll start to be able to see the planet then visible in the morning sky. You would see it as large through your telescope and as a crescent, but on the other side, for example, of what was depicted earlier. And then as Venus recedes from us, we see it get smaller through the telescope, and it shows up as a quarter, as a gibbous, and so on. Galileo realized that the observations that he was making of Venus definitively proved that all the planets orbit the sun.